The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
In my experience, when I finish the first draft of a novel, a lot of things have changed at the end. So, my characters have become maybe different characters than they were in the beginning. The ending might not be exactly what I had expected. The movement of the novel, I might realize, wow, that first section was just completely unnecessary, or that first 2 or 3 chapters. So I think that for me, it's always been really important to even write out all the scenes and look at each scene and make sure that it's contributing to the movement of the novel.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Shawn Smucker has published 5 novels in the last 5 years, most recently, The Weight of Memory. He's also co-written some 30 books. Shawn and his wife, Miley Silva, coach, teach, and encourage other writers in a creative community they call The Stories Between Us. They host a podcast of the same name. In this episode, Shawn Smucker and I discuss revision, point of view, and when it's okay for writers to stop pushing and take a break. Shawn Smucker, I'm so happy to have you back on the Habit Podcast. It's been a while.
Jonathan, it's great to be here. Thanks, man.
You have been so productive over the last few years. How many novels have you published in the last few years?
This last summer was my 5th, and I think it was 5 in 5 years. I think so. Yeah.
And were you just sort of cranking those out in the course of about 5 years, or is this a backlog of things you've done for a long time?
The first 2 were a little bit of a backlog. So The Day the Angels Fell, The Edge of Over There, the 2 YA books that I wrote, I had written those previously, and I had even self-published the first one. So those 2 were kind of sitting around. And then when I signed with a publishing house, they wanted to do those 2 first. So that gave me, a year or 2 to kind of jump onto book 3, and then, which wasn't related to the first 2. The last 2 felt a little bit time crunched, because at that point I was at a year, I guess. I had a year to write each one. So that started to feel a little bit tight.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know I don't know if you're still doing this. Is co-writing still your kind of day job?
Yeah. Yeah. For the most part, co-writing, I've co-written maybe 30 books in the last 10, 15 years.
I've done a little of that, and I'd like to hear you talk about, that can burn up a lot of creative energy. How do you do that kind of creative work and then have time to, or have energy or space or whatever to write fiction? write your own
That's
stuff?
That's a great question. Maybe I don't, because I feel kind of burnt out right now.
Yeah.
I mean, through the years, it was usually I'd be working on. Well, first of all, let me say this: the books that I co-write were mostly memoirs, and they were mostly stories being told to me. So it didn't require a lot of the same sorts of creativity that maybe writing a novel requires. You know, where you're coming up with everything from scratch. You're thinking through characters, narrative arcs, plots. You know, I wasn't doing all that for other people. So I would, the main energy that's required for those sorts of projects is really listening. I think that was probably what wore me out more than necessarily the actual writing, you know, was just listening to someone for 2 or 3 hours at a time, taking notes, and then transcribing that recording and using that to write their life story. So I always felt like I had something to bring energy wise when it came to the fiction part. That felt different to me somehow.
Yeah. Because I found it hard to do both.
Yeah.
But I have a feeling I'm not as energetic as you are as a writer anyway.
Yeah, I don't know. You know, the thing with co-writing that I loved and that I still love is when I'm helping folks write like a memoir, for example, just that sense that you get from them that you are helping them to do something they could never do or they would never have the time to do. And then the finished product that you have that they're super proud of. I mean, that's such a wonderful feeling to know that I helped someone bring their story into the world, you know, a story that probably wouldn't have come into the world. And then I do a lot of family histories as well, like for older folks. And again, it's just so rewarding when their kids read the book and they come to me and they say, I never knew that. Like, I never knew that my dad did this, or I never knew that he went through this, or so it's very rewarding that kind of work. And I think that helps to make up for it. But also the process is such that you move from one thing to the next pretty quickly. So, you know, for 6 or 8 weeks, I'm gathering information. And then for a couple of weeks, I'm transcribing. And then for a couple of months, I'm writing. And so it's not like just constantly writing all the time, every day for somebody else.
Yeah. Now, your co-writing work, are you sometimes, so it sounds like sometimes you have sort of private clients who are writing family histories for their family. Are you also doing work for where publishers call you and say, we've got this manuscript or we've got this, we need some help getting this thing done? You're doing that too, right?
Yeah, I've done both. Yeah.
So you may or may not want to comment on this, and I'm not going to require that you comment on it. There were times where I completely get that writing a family history for a family, incredibly rewarding work. And some of the co-writing I did, I loved it because here are people who have great things to say and don't necessarily, I mean, I knew, you know, I worked with a couple of people who they could utter brilliant paragraphs, like things I could never speak. And yet when they tried to write it, it was almost like there was some disconnect between their mouth and their hand. And it was really rewarding to say, you just say what you just said and I'll write it down for you. You know, you've got these great things to say. And I love helping them put their important ideas on paper. And then I also had some books that I thought, the world doesn't need this book. You know, that was more a publisher trying to, you know, cash in on a trend, or, you know, finding some celebrity, minor celebrity, right? I'm not writing, you know, I never did anything for major celebrities, but, you know, sort of C-list celebrities maybe. And, you know, and kind of felt like, I'm not sure this is a good use of our energies and resources.
Yes.
You got anything to say about that?
Yeah, you know, that I would say, while very much in the majority of the projects that I've done, there have been a couple where I felt that way. Mm-hmm. And there was, even online for a little while, there was kind of a firestorm about the ethics around co-writing and ghostwriting. And so I think there's certainly a lot of questions around that whole thing. For me, I've always tried to be a part of projects where it was open, like that this person has a co-writer and at least mentioned in the acknowledgments and that sort of thing. I've had a few ghostwriting jobs where I wasn't mentioned at all, which doesn't bother me, but I know that some readers are bothered by that when they find out. Yeah. It is kind of it can be an interesting path to walk as a writer. There are a lot of questions like that.
Yeah. Because, at one level, the skill you bring is you can put together good sentences, and it's rewarding to put together good sentences. And then at another level, there's, I've got something to say, which is completely divorced, is probably completely divorced from making a living as a co-writer. May or may not be. I know there were times where I was able to help somebody think through what they wanted to say and say, have you considered the following? And it felt like I contributed something there. But I, as you said, that it can be ethically complicated, the co-writing.
Yeah. I would say that for me, co-writing and ghostwriting was probably one of the best disciplines. It served me very well as a writer to have to make a living doing that, because I really learned a lot about deadlines. I learned a lot about how I work as a writer. And I think part of the reason that I can be, or that I have been so prolific over the last 5 years, is because for the 6 or 7 years before that, I was co-writing 4 or 5 books a year. And so you learn pretty quickly, I can write a book. Like I can write a book length project, and this is how I do it. Like this is how it works for me. And, I learned, 1,000 words a day. 1,000 words a day is doable when I'm in the middle of a project. And that means a novel in 4 or 5 months, or the first draft. So I did learn so much. I wrote so many words that it was a huge service to me as a writer, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I know what you mean. I don't know if you've ever written advertising copy or brochure, sort of worked for a marketing firm, but man, that's several deadlines a day sometimes. And I learned so much about, producing, and not just producing sentences, but producing ideas. You'd think, I can't possibly come up with any more ideas, and then you have to, and you do. Yeah. And that's whenever I teach writing, I try to inculcate the idea. There's always more where that came from. Whatever idea you just had, you didn't just, it's you don't have a finite number of ideas, and now you have one fewer than you did. Right? The more, the more ideas you generate, the more ideas you generate.
Yeah, I like that.
Or receive, or whatever the right verb is for what you do with ideas. Right?
Yeah.
Well, so you have helped other writers get their work out there through co-writing, or get their ideas out there through co-writing. You also help other writers through coaching, and would you say teaching? How do you? I know you do. Yeah. Somewhat you do. You call coaching. Do you? Tell me about that.
Yeah. So my wife Miley and I started a podcast a few years ago called The Stories Between Us.
The link to which will be in the show description.
Yeah. And when we started that, it was really because we're both writers, and we were having these conversations all the time about writing, just around the house, in the kitchen, at night. And we thought, what? These have been really helpful for us to work through things together. Maybe we should just record these and put them out there. And so we've done that. It's not like the world's most famous podcast, but we love it. We have a good time together talking about those things. And so the courses that we started to offer were really just another step in that direction. We thought, well, we provide each other with so much feedback and encouragement. And what if we opened that up to some other folks, and we kind of went on a journey together. So the first course that we did was last year. We started in March, and that was a 9-month novel. So we charted out like a 9-month intensive where we have Zoom meetings and we do weekly teaching videos and, lots of encouragement. And we had, I think we've had about 14 people this year who finished their novel. They started in March, ended in around November.
Yeah.
And that was such a fun, super rewarding experience to see, especially because there were so many of those writers who, naturally hit hiccups along the way where they're like, I don't think I can do this anymore. Something changed at work or family dynamics and to be there right beside someone and say, okay, well, hold on a second. Like, let's adjust your plan. Let's change some things this way. And to be able to walk people through that and see finished novels was really cool. So we're going to do that again this coming year. We started a 6-month memoir class in October with students. And so that's been going really well.
Oh, good.
And then we have a revision class that we're starting in January, which is it's probably about 12 to 14 weeks. And it's really for anybody who has a finished first draft, but isn't sure where to go with of a novel. So that, but it's been really fun for us to be able to do that together. It's also kind of lightened my load as far as the number of projects I need to pick up as a co-writer. So it's been nice to kind of mix that up because I've been co-writing for 12 years now. So it's been a good change.
So when you teach, or you said you got instructional videos, and I don't know how many. I know this class hasn't started yet, or this group, or whatever the right word is. So I don't know how many of these videos you have created, but what's the kind of thing you tell somebody? Like when you talk to somebody about revision, I'd love to talk about revision for a little while. So what are some principles that you inculcate? If you're willing to, I don't want you to give away everything.
Yeah. No, hey, our syllabus is online, so anybody can go look at it if they want. I think the first thing that I've realized about myself when it comes to revision is that I want to have a really good handle on what I've created. I don't think that I get to the end of a first draft and always completely understand what I've done or what I was trying to do. And so the first 3 or 4 weeks of the revision course is really just encouraging the students to make sure you know your characters, make sure you're aware of the structure of your story, make sure that you've chosen the point of view. So let's be consistent with that. It's really just sort of going through a checklist of basics initially and saying, let's get a really good grasp on what we have here in front of us. We know it's not good. We know it's probably pretty awful. But let's see what we've got. And then at that point, we dive into critique groups and giving and receiving feedback. Because I think that once you have a good handle on what you have, you've created your first draft, it can be really hard to get outside of yourself and revisit that work in a way that allows you to make the needed correction. So that's why we really want to emphasize the critique side of things and getting feedback and then sort of moving through that 12 weeks of taking a chunk of the novel and then another chunk and then another chunk. So that's sort of the process that we're going to go through.
Tell me about this idea of not really knowing what you like, finishing a draft and still not knowing what you have.
Well, in my experience, when I finished the first draft of the novel, a lot of things have changed at the end. So, my characters have become maybe different characters than they were in the beginning. The ending might not be exactly what I had expected. The movement of the novel, I might realize, wow, that first section was just completely unnecessary, or that first 2 or 3 chapters. So I think that for me, it's always been really important to even write out all the scenes and look at each scene and make sure that it's contributing to the movement of the novel. Also, when I start novels, I tend not to outline too much. So I don't always know exactly what the main question is or what the character's main desire is. But I think by the end of the novel, then I finally do know, okay, well, what this character actually wanted more than anything else in the world was this. And so then I can go back and look at each scene and say, does that scene contribute to bringing him along that path? Or is that scene now completely irrelevant? And so that, I think that's what I'm talking about when I talk about taking stock of what you have now in front of you.
Yeah. I think it's so important in revision to distinguish between, to say this chapter, this section is unnecessary to the final product doesn't mean it was unnecessary to get there, and it's, you maybe had to write that, explore that in order to get to the point where you really did know what you were saying. And I think, I think one of the painful things about revision is that not if you can't separate those things, if you, because it was important for you as the writer to write that chapter, it's hard to see maybe it's not, important, necessary to the final work, but there are literary concerns and there are emotional concerns in the revision process.
Yeah. When so my first book, The Day the Angels Fell, about 1.5 years ago, was optioned by a small production company. And so I have no idea if anything will ever come of it or not, but I was asked to take a shot at writing the screenplay. And so I did that and proceeded to realize, this was a book that I had written, 4 years ago, proceeded to realize that, wow, my plot was not very tight. It was alarmingly easy to remove scenes that I had not really considered before. And it's something that's really stuck in my mind when it comes to storytelling now. And I think my novels will be much better going forward for that, for seeing how, just how easy it can be to remove scenes if you're not really aware of the story itself and not paying attention to what has happened in the story when you finish that first draft. Yeah. Yeah. Now, on the other hand, one difference between a novel and a screenplay is that you do have the luxury to maybe do some things that aren't quite as necessary. Yes.
Because you're not paying a film crew, right? And you're not hiring actors.
And you don't have to limit it to 1.5 hours of,
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's worth noting too. Lest one, beat oneself up for.
Sure. Yeah. And, I also realized, Jonathan, that when you dedicate your life or, a chunk of your life to writing, as I have for the last 10 to 12 years, and I was very interested even long before that, but I feel like the last decade has been very much a concentrated effort. I realize how much I've learned in that time and how much I've improved from where I was in the beginning to where I am now. And also I'm realizing that if I would ever want to be good at writing screenplays, it would take a lot of time.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I'm at that point in my life right now where I want to be a novice at something else quite yet. Maybe down the road I'll feel that burning desire to become a poet or a screenwriter. But I'm really happy right now with where I am as a novelist and my trajectory and how much I've learned. And I think I just want to continue to focus on that. I realized that after I finished writing the screenplay.
Yeah. Did the production company see your screenplay and then say, thanks, we'll go find someone else who writes screenplays too?
Something like that. Yeah. Yeah, something like that.
No, I so admire people who pick up new skills late in life, and yet it terrifies me the thought of writing poems that somebody else might. I'm not going to write poems anybody else is going to see. The thought of writing poems, period, is a little alarming to me.
Yeah,
I can write little funny, narrative funny poems, but the kind of poetry that I really, really admire.
Well, I think as you get deeper and deeper into any particular, well, I'll say this for me anyway, as I've gone deeper into fiction and as I've drilled down like this past year, I've really been trying to learn a lot about close third person. So I read How Fiction Works by James Wood, and he has an excellent,
that section on
that.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I just love that section of that book.
He totally, for me, explained that concept in a way that I had never really wrapped my arms around. And so, when you learn something that's super in depth in a discipline that you're working on, it can be a little bit overwhelming for me to think, wow, there are things like that about screenwriting that I would have to learn, as I would make my way into that. And so it does put me off a little bit, I think, of going down a different road at this point.
Yeah. By the way, have you read George Saunders' book, A Swim in the Pond in the Rain? I might be getting.
Is that the one with the Russian short stories?
Yeah. Yeah.
It is on my nightstand right now. It's like next in line, but I haven't read it.
Well, it needs to get off the nightstand and into your hands.
Okay.
And into your brain. Yeah, it is so good. But I'm glad you mentioned the James Wood book. It's How Fiction Works. Is that the name of it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that book is so good, but especially the parts you just talked about. Mm-hmm. I didn't learn as much from the other parts of the book. I don't know if that's because I wasn't quite ready to learn whatever those parts of the book had to say, but that part just blew me away. So
yeah. I had that book with me in Tennessee actually, and I was with some relatives at a hotel, and I was reading beside the pool. This was like 3 or 4 years ago. And I stood up and went to grab something out of the pool and just threw the book into the water, totally inadvertently. And so I didn't pick it up again for a couple of years. And then when I read it just recently, that close third person was, wow, that just, it really, really spoke. And especially I think because that's what I enjoy writing in that third person, but I couldn't wrap my arms around what I was trying to do with that, almost a blending of first person and third person. Like you're so inside that third person narrator's head. Yeah. But the way that he explained it and broke it down and showed it, in Graham Greene and some of the other examples, it was really, really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to remember your most recent novel, The Weight of Memory. Is that close third or is that first person?
That's first person. Well, it's first and it's almost second because the first person narrator is talking to his granddaughter and sort of retelling these stories. It's a little bit of a mix. Yeah.
Yeah. And the reason I couldn't double check, as I told you before, is because my dog literally ate that book. So, but you were doing something interesting with point of view there, right? We have this narrator we don't know if he's losing some capacity, some mental capacity, but it's kind of hard to know when he's confused and when he's not confused. And then there's some magical realism mixed in there, and I don't. You got like that's not a question. That's just
no. Well, the narrative voice in that came to me because I love Gilead so much. Mm-hmm. I love Gilead. And what I've always really enjoyed about that book is Marilyn Robinson's way of bringing us into this super intimate relationship between the older father and his very young son. And as I read through it over and over again, her book, and just tried to figure out what she was doing there, I realized that part of that intimacy, I think, comes out of the second person. It's like it's like you're overhearing, a conversation that maybe you're not really sure, should I be listening in on this? Like, this is really personal and this is really intimate. And so I didn't actually write The Weight of Memory that way first. I started it off as a close third, and Miley suggested that I just play around a little bit in first person. And then as I started to do that, I realized, oh, what if I had the narrator actually writing to his granddaughter, because he is under a lot of stress. Like you mentioned, his sort of he's a little bit unreliable because he's just received a terminal diagnosis, and his granddaughter is very eccentric and quirky, and you don't always really know how much to believe about the stories that she tells. And so, I did try and create a little bit of a unknowing in that way.
So did I have it wrong? Was the narrator himself relatively reliable, but he was interacting with stories that were less reliable? That's
probably a little bit more of a fair way to put it. Although, because he is the primary narrator, he's telling you the story, but he's sort of alongside of you in that uncertainty. So he's like, well, this is what she told me.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure what to think of it.
Yeah. All right. Well, forgive me. As I said, my dog ate my book, so I wasn't. Yeah. But one thing that makes me think about, and that I remember thinking about when I was reading that book, is that we think of a story being a plot, and that the interest in a story comes from, the sequence of events. We think of that as being the main interest in a story. But we need to not forget that you get a whole bonus. I mean, I love the complexity that we just described there. We've got a man telling a story who's had a terminal diagnosis. He's overwrought emotionally. And then he's interacting with these stories that we don't know what to make of them. That whole point of view question is as interesting as the sequence of events in the plot. And I love that stuff. That is so. And when I teach writing, I try to speak in terms of, or when I teach, fiction writing. You don't drive yourself crazy trying to come up with another, unexpected, brilliant plot twist. I mean, if it comes to you, great. But you need to sort of put those other layers in place of narration, character, these kinds of things that are, I won't say they're more important than plot, but they're more important than jazzing up the plot with new plot twists and subplots and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Every time I start a novel, I tell myself this is going to be the simplest novel I've ever written. I want to start in the beginning and just tell the story straightforward to the end. And it just never ends up being that way. I'm not sure if, I'm not sure why. I do like trying different things. Yeah. And I think I would get bored if I was continually writing the same sorts of stories with the same sorts of plots and the same sorts of characters. So it is some of that just comes out of my desire to play and to have fun and to try something different.
Yeah. Somebody in actually more than one person on Goodreads said, I never know what to expect from Shawn Smucker. When I pick up a new Shawn Smucker novel, I never know what to expect. And they meant it in the best possible sense, right? But it might be magical realism, it might not be. It might be, who knows what I'm going to get when I read this book. Which literary agents don't approve of that kind of behavior.
They do not.
Do you get scolded? Do you get scolded by your agent?
Well, my initial agent who got me into the publishing world with The Day the Angels Fell, The Edge of Over There, and Light from Distant Stars, she moved on to other things. And so I had to find a new agent. And one of the first conversations I had with my new agent a couple of years ago was she was very interested in what my focus was going to be. Are you going to write YA? Or are you going to write, adult fiction? Or she said, obviously, it's a free country. You can write whatever you want, but it might behoove you to, to pick a track and stay in it.
Yeah. And you said, thanks for the free country part.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Can we talk about Marilyn Roberts for just a minute?
Yeah, please. I would love to.
Speaking of point of view, her Gilead tetralogy is such a study in point of view, right? The same, I mean, roughly the same story. A lot of overlap in plot between those 4 books.
Yeah.
And all the action, I mean, all the goodie comes from, here's the story, the way it looks from John Ames's point of view, and here's how it looks from Jack Balton's point of view, and here's how it looks from Lila's point of view, and here's how it looks from Glory's point of view. And it's both, point of view is both what I can literally see with my eyeballs from that point of view character. There are things, literally things that John Ames can see that Glory can't see, and vice versa. But also, when we've seen the same thing, how does that point of view character interpret what they've seen? And you talk to people who read Gilead first, and their view of who John Ames is compared to the people who read Home, the Glory story.
Yeah.
What they think about John Ames is really interesting to think about, the difference in whose eyeballs you're seeing this action, mostly, especially those 2 books, so much overlap in the action from 2 different points of view. I think it's just so instructive in what point of view is for.
Yeah. And it's a real practical issue as well, Jonathan. With the family histories that I've written, and this comes up a lot in my novels, this idea of our unreliable memory.
Yeah.
I have this story that I tell a lot. I helped a 94-year-old woman write her biography, and she had a very strong memory of when she was in her early 30s. So this was from 60 years before her husband had died. He was out on a boat, had a stroke. They brought him in on a little sort of like a floating dock, loaded him into the ambulance, and then she got in the ambulance and drove away. And she said on her way to that, she had dropped her son off at baseball practice. Well, her son was sitting there in the room with me. He was around 70. And so he would have been about 10 at the time. And he said, "No, Mom, that's not how it happened. I was right there. I was standing right beside you when they brought Dad in. I would never forget that. Like, that's one of the most powerful memories I have in my life." And she said, "Absolutely not. You were not there. I specifically remember dropping you off and then driving down and then realizing what had happened." And they went on for 10 or 15 minutes back and forth, trying to prove to one another that theirs was the correct memory. And, that has had such a huge impact on the way that I hear stories, the way that I hear memories, the way that I write books, because I do enjoy tapping into that sort of unknowable nature of the past, especially once you get beyond a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades. We do so many mental gymnastics, I think, to mold our memories in ways that suit us, in ways that prop up our view of the world and, what we think the world is or should be like. And it's pretty remarkable when you're on the outside of that and you see how 2 people are so certain of this memory that they have that are completely conflicting and could never actually coexist in the real world.
That particular example, that doesn't sound like 2 people who had an agenda, right? They just had different. They didn't have good reasons for remembering that way. They just, and then layer on top of that, as you said, the way we massage memories to suit ourselves and the way we think things need to be. Said everybody grows up in a different family. The kids, you get the kids in a room and what they remember about the same house they lived in. It sounds like they lived in different houses sometimes.
Yeah. And maybe that's why I enjoyed Marilyn Robinson's book so much. When you get those different perspectives, I don't know that she included, any conflicting stories or memories, but just to have that luxury as a reader to say, okay, well, this is how John Ames told the story. And then, oh, wow, this is actually, a sideways view of that with additional information and relationships and all of that.
I think in those two books, the Home and in Gilead, and I can't speak as I didn't look as carefully with Jack, the most recent one, but when they are just showing what they saw and heard, they are very much in agreement. It's their interpretation.
Yes, right.
Yes. And now, as you said, there's also the layer of the things people just think they're just showing and not interpreting comes into conflict. But it felt like Marilyn Robinson was very careful to say, we're going to show the same events. And some of I know a few of the bits of dialogue are word for word between the two books.
That's really cool.
And yet the experience of those events is so different in those two books.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, I've got to ask you the standard question here for the conclusion, and that is, who are the writers who make you want to write, Shawn?
Yeah, I recently started listening to a book called The Brothers K by David James Duncan. I love that book. I've read it many times, and I've been feeling a little bit stuck in my writing, and I know that whenever I read or listen to that book, it just makes me want to write. There's something about his first person in there, the narrator that almost awakens stories in me. It just makes me want to do that. I think the difficult part about that is when you have writers who write so beautifully and they make you want to write, then when I actually write, my first drafts just look so horrible because I'm comparing them to these books that I love.
That have gone through who knows how many rounds of editing.
Exactly. Yeah. But so he's one. Definitely. All the Light We Cannot See, Anthony Doerr. I love that book. I've read it a couple of times the whole way through, but then other times I just pick it up and read, short sections. And
have you read his new book yet?
I have not. I've heard good things about it, but I haven't.
Yeah,
I haven't read
it.
Great.
Yeah, I love what he does. You alluded a couple of times to feeling a little stuck and burnout. You got any more to say about that?
Well, it's interesting, because we're walking all these writers through 9-month novel, writing their first draft. And such an important part of getting that first draft written is consistency, getting into some kind of a rhythm that you can hold yourself accountable to. And yet I find myself in this place of not necessarily wanting to write, or knowing that there are things that I need to do to finish this current book that I've written, and just not finding the time to do it. And so I've been really torn between this idea of, when do we need to give ourselves some space and some time to just kind of live life and take in things and not be writing and be okay with that. And when is it the right time to just push yourself and maybe be a little bit hard on yourself and say, no, come on now, you got to, you need to finish this thing. You got to get it written, get your butt in the chair. So that's been, I don't know. I've just kind of been thinking through that. I'm not sure that I've come up with any answers. Something that Miley said that I thought was wise is that if you've already created a writing routine and a rhythm in your life, then it makes a little bit more sense to give yourself a break. But if you're at that point in your writing journey where you've never really been consistent, you've never really had that kind of a writing schedule, then maybe you do need to be a little bit harder on yourself, just so that you can create that, so that you have it to fall back on. I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I think I'm the wrong person to ask. I've never had a ton of success with being consistent. Like I write to deadlines. When I've got a deadline, I figure out a way to do it, and which, frankly, quit working at one point. Right? I just kind of, I got to where I couldn't even write to deadlines. Couldn't write. It's, I feel like so much of the writing life is a question of knowing, and you've already alluded to this, in what ways do I need to be hard on myself, not go easy on myself. What ways do I need to cut myself some slack? Because if you keep pushing, it's, you got to leave room for grace in the writing, in the process, right? It's you do reach a point of diminishing returns with if I just put forth more effort. I mean, I can put forth more effort and write better sentences, but there's a limit to how much effort I can put into having something to say. And you do have to receive. You have to remind yourself, I woke up today in a world I didn't make. And the extent to which I can receive that will give me something to say. Now, on the other hand, I'm just not very good at being hard on myself in the right ways. I mean, in terms of discipline or whatever. But I do think rest and Sabbath is just a part of the writing, an unavoidable part of the writing process. So you're just going to end up producing stuff that the world doesn't need, if it's not coming out of what you've received. Yeah. That's not exactly advice, though. That's not. That's a general principle that I still don't know how to apply. Yeah.
I was in a really good routine for the last 5 or 6 years where I would spend most of January, February, March digging into my first draft and getting that written, usually by April or May. And then I'd spend, a couple of months away from it, send it to my editor. I would hear back from her late in the summer, do a round of revisions, send it back, and then do a final round of revisions at the end of the year. And it felt like it felt seasonal. It felt
like you're a farmer.
It just really, it seemed like a good way forward, and it's worked for me. I've written, not all published, but 6 novels now. And I think I've just this winter hit a stuckness that I haven't felt before. Like I have one more round of revisions that I need to do on this novel. And I cannot find it. I just can't find it. So that's kind of interesting. And I guess that's why I'm thinking about it a lot, because I'm kind of in the middle of it right now.
I had never until this minute thought about, we talk about our daily routines, but what if there was a church calendar for the writer? I mean, this idea of seasonal, we're used to, people from certain traditions are used to the idea of it's Lent, and then then it's Easter, then it's ordinary. Okay, I'm now revealing how little I know about the church calendar, but
yeah.
There's ordinary time, there's Advent, there's I guess Pentecost. I'm done. I'm not going to continue to try to fake it. But that's really, I'm going to ponder that in my heart. That's maybe you need to write that article, Shawn.
Yeah.
Which may turn into a book. But do this. Yeah. If it's only an article, please don't turn it into a book. Okay.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of those.
Yeah, right. All right. We better go. Thanks, Shawn. Shawn Smucker, I really appreciate you being here on the Habit Podcast.
I always enjoyed talking with you, Jonathan. Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com. And to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate. Special thanks as well to Taylor Linhart for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for Season 3 of the Habit Podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorlinhart.com.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.